There are really multiple naming conventions which are used to describe various subcortical brain structures. Some of the distinctions are historical, some are neurodevelopmental, and some are purely anatomical. It's probably best not to get hung up too much on terminology, as long as you have the basic sense of what the structures are and what they do. Let's turn our attention to the hindbrain, or rhombencephalon, which is the lowest part of the brain, contiguous with the spinal cord. In humans, it's at the bottom of the brain, though in most animals, it's in the back. The hindbrain's various centers control functions like heart rate, respiration, and swallowing. Usually they do all of this with very little or no input from the rest of the brain. This may not seem especially impressive, but in many animals, it's basically the brain's only function. The terminology we use to describe different parts of the brain can get a bit messy, and sometimes the definitions overlap. Usually, we use the word hindbrain to refer to the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla and the pons are part of a structure that you might have heard of called the brainstem. While it's traditionally part of the hindbrain, we generally don't include the cerebellum, Latin for little brain, in the brainstem. The cerebellum is a much newer structure, appearing just 400 million years ago, and it'll be the subject of its own future lesson. In another confusing bit of terminology, we usually include the midbrain, which will be the subject of the next lesson, as part of the brainstem. The medulla is located at the very base of the brain, just where the spinal cord enters the skull. It's bordered on its superior, or top edge, by the pons, and it sends fibers directly down into the spinal cord. The medulla connects the higher levels of the brain to the spinal cord and allows for maintenance of posture and basic protective motor reflexes, like those that cause vomiting, coughing, sneezing, and swallowing. In addition, it's responsible for a variety of autonomic nervous system functions. It's responsible for the regulation of breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and digestion, which it modulates through interaction with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. For example, pressure receptors in the medulla mediate vasomotor reflexes to adjust the widening and tightening of our blood vessels, while chemoreceptors regulate respiratory function by detecting the change in pH in our blood, signaling the lungs to adjust breathing and oxygenation rate when they climb too high or fall too low. The medulla carries out these functions in an autonomous fashion, unconsciously. While the cortex may be more evolutionarily advanced than the medulla, it has a lot less to say about your vital processes. Cerebral override will allow you to speed or slow your breathing, for example, to a limited extent. But the moment the medulla feels that you have slowed or sped respiration too extensively, it'll take over, entirely overriding cortical signals. As such, you're physiologically incapable of holding your breath until you die, although many tantruming children may try to prove you wrong. Just on top of the medulla sits the pons, which serves as a bridge to the midbrain. Pons means bridge in Latin, and indeed the pons is a key relay station, bridging the gap between the medulla, cortex, and the cerebellum. Thick bundles of nerve fibers run through the pons, conducting nerve signals from the brain down to the cerebellum and medulla. The pons also contains several nuclei with functions comparable to those of the medulla and the midbrain. The pontine nuclei are involved in regulation of sleep, respiration and swallowing, chewing, bladder control, some eye movements, facial expressions, and upright posture. It's often difficult to disentangle which functions are related to the pons and which to the medulla, and to a certain extent the midbrain as well. This is largely because a common set of interconnected nuclei, called the reticular formation, runs throughout the three brainstem structures, critically linking their function. Although the midbrain, pons, and medulla individually control discrete physiological functions, you can think of the brainstem structures as a single regulatory system. These structures are so crucial that it's not simple to find disorders of the brainstem, since most brainstem injuries or impairment result in instant death. One particular disease, central pontine myelinosis, is a disorder in which typically myelinated nerve projections in the pons lose their myelin wrapping, and thus the ability to conduct nerve signals appropriately. As a result, messages fail to pass between the cerebellum and the medulla and cortex. Affected subjects have increasing difficulty with their sense of balance, walking, touch, swallowing, and speaking. As the condition worsens, it can lead to locked-in syndrome, or LIS, a condition in which a patient is conscious and aware, but can't move or communicate verbally due to complete paralysis of nearly all voluntary muscles in the body. Untreated, the condition is lethal, and even with aggressive action, 2/3 of patients remain significantly disabled.